Welcome to episode 4 of the Life After Deconstruction podcast. My name is Anthony Miller, and I am super excited to share with you the conversation that I recently had with my dear friend, Lindsay Hansen Park. Lindsay is the executive director for Sunstone. She is the creator of the Year of Polygamy podcast. And over the years, she's been involved in many different groups and projects and experiences that facilitate her bringing a tremendous amount of wisdom, thoughtfulness, and experience to today's discussion. In this episode, we talk about the experience that is common for many believing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the community, the experience of ministering and service and belonging and love, peace, joy, connection, grace, that gets enmeshed with one's sense of identity. And that after the differentiation of a faith deconstruction or a faith crisis, sometimes we can find ourselves in a very lonely place, in the metaphorical wilderness, seeking to recreate or reconnect or to find new community so that we can replicate and once again experience that belonging, that service, that ministering, that connection, that transcendent grace, love, peace, and joy in our lives. In this episode, we talk about the journey of longing for and seeking that kind of connection after a faith deconstruction. I hope you enjoy the discussion. I've invited my friend Lindsay Hansen Park to join us. She is someone who's been instrumental to my experience and my journey, and I see her as a very wise, experienced person and like to lean on her from time to time to get her input on things. And today I wanted to talk about the importance of the experience of community that Latter-day Saints have as believers, and then the dynamic that happens once they go through a faith deconstruction. And so in any event, welcome, Lindsay, to the podcast today. For those who don't know you, and I can't imagine there aren't many who don't, could you provide us a brief introduction to you, your work, your projects, things like that?
Sure, yeah. I'm a mom living in Utah, grew up in Mormonism most of my life, and I started blogging in my 20s. It was in my 20s when I started blogging for feminist Mormon housewives when blogs were all the rage online. And that sort of thrust me into Mormon activism, into the Wear Pants to Church Day, Ordained Women, a bunch of different little movements. And I found a lot of community within the Mormon feminist community. And then I started a podcast called Year of Polygamy about the history of Mormon polygamy. And that sort of took off and changed my life in some remarkable, crazy ways. And I'm currently the executive director of Sunstone Education Foundation. It's been around for about 45 years. And it's sort of a archive library, open forum for all things Mormon. So we have a conference every year where we have speakers come and talk on any kind of topic in Mormonism, historians, scholars, scientists, artists, therapists, all those things come and talk. And we have a history podcast that I co-host with Brian Buchanan, the Sunstone Mormon History Podcast, where we do deep, nerdy dives into Mormon history. And I do a lot of other work too. I've recently consulted on the Hulu Under the Banner of Heaven television series. I'm working on 2 Hulu series right now and a bunch of other film projects. So yeah, I have a very busy, full life, and it mostly revolves around Mormon history these days.
Well, it's very, very interesting. I've found initially when I went through the deconstructive process, I studied a lot of church history because I was trying to uncover the meaning of things, and where things came from and why, trying to understand the why. And then eventually it just became, because it's so darned interesting, and that's why I still like to read books and watch and listen to podcasts and particularly the work that you're doing there at Sunstone.
Yeah, I always say proving the church true or false with the history is the least interesting question for me. I mean, Brian and I have so much fun on the Sunstone Mormon History podcast because we can kind of let loose. But learning that, a young Joseph Smith was drunk and preaching about angels on a farm and singing, and they had to give him, they put hot pepper sauce so he would stop drinking and go away. And learning that, W. Phelps's middle name is William Wines Phelps. Like, it's just such a stupid thing, but it's so interesting to know. And or that Sam Brannan named Calistoga Hot Springs because he was completely drunk and he mixed up his words. Like, that's the fun of Mormon history to me. It's just wild, crazy frontier men creating this huge culture that's affected all of us. And we really like to get into the stories of all of that.
No doubt.
And they all involve alcohol for some reason.
It is they say it's a social lubricant, I guess. So it does add some creativity to things. So for the listener and viewer today, the idea of the podcast that I've created here is to talk about once someone's processed the experience of grief or experience of trauma, and they've have a faith crisis or a faith transition of some kind, and they've deconstructed to kind of unpack meaning, then I think there are a lot of conversations that are interesting to have about what happens after that deconstructive process. And today I wanted to have a discussion, and I'm going to read a little bit of to introduce you to this topic. And what I wrote is that it seems that religious groups that lean more theologically strict and cohesive in their collective identity, like the LDS Church, are quite good at providing opportunities for service, ministering, and for community for its members. For many Latter-day Saints, these opportunities seem to tend to foster a sense of connection, of grace, vulnerability, belonging, love, peace, joy, sometimes referred to as the fruits of the Spirit, through service, ministering, traditions, rituals, and gatherings together. And what I witnessed with many post-deconstructed Latter-day Saints is they long for that experience, and sometimes they experience a painful dissonance when they have attempted to participate in the church, in meetings and gatherings with believing friends and family. Many times they experience getting policed or shamed or othered when they talk about their shifts in faith away from literalism, or when they talk about their concerns with cultural or doctrinal issues. And so, in other words, they often no longer feel authentically like they belong in a vulnerable way to those communities and types of family relationships where they felt that connection, grace, belonging, vulnerability, fruits of the Spirit kind of thing. So what I've noticed is for many post-deconstructed Latter-day Saints, they're seeking that, they want that, and they experience a sense of grief and loss that they don't have that anymore. And so they have a desire to go out and participate in those kinds of experiences in the post-deconstruction community. And it seems there are many groups and individuals that are striving to find their way and their place in that community, and they're seeking for those kinds of experiences so that they can feel those connections and belonging. What I have noticed is that sometimes when individuals or the overall community in post-deconstruction do those kinds of things or participate in them, sometimes they help for a time, sometimes it's a longer period of time, sometimes things start and then they have a relatively short lifespan. Sometimes they become very dysfunctional and there can be problems with them. I noticed that earlier this year, Patrick Mason, when he interviewed with Margie and John on Mormon Stories, one question that he asked them was about community. And he asked, who is going to bring you a casserole when you're sick? Something like that. And I think the question was both literal and metaphorical of what is the post-Mormon community doing to satisfy those things. So I wanted to have conversations with some people and harvest some of their observations, wisdom, and cautions about these kinds of experiences in the community. I also want to talk about the natural tendency of being an introvert versus an extrovert, of how it affects these things. And I wanted to explore how being in mixed faith family relationships affects these things. So that's the topic that I wanted to talk about today. Um, so first, Lindsay, what observations or comments do you have about the topic?
Well, I have a lot to say actually, so we might have to direct it. But yeah, I mean, I think we can just start chronologically maybe in the experience if that's helpful. Like you said, people grew up in the faith, and one of the beautiful things about Mormonism, I don't think you can argue, is that its sense of community. I mean, that is one of the perks of any sort of high in demand religion. And if you look at human behavior and the way that humans have organized, that's why I'm so obsessed with the history. I'm always trying to figure out how we got here, why it's like this, why we're like this. And you see over and over throughout history, different periods of times, the different organizational structures that humans have. And you could argue that early human connections, early human tribes, collectives, were kind of cultish. I mean, if we were to drop down in a time machine now to an ancient tribe, we would probably witness rituals that we found, very barbaric and outdated and horrifying. I was talking to a friend who went and got to visit an isolated, nearly untouched indigenous tribe in South America. And their marriage practices were deeply offensive. Their sexual practices were deeply offensive. And I think that that's what, when you have these small communities, that can be the downside, right? You have this sense of community, this sense of belonging, but there's always a shadow side to everything. And Mormonism certainly has that too. Um, but what Mormonism offers is a bigger sense of that sort of tribe. Juanita Brooks, the famed Mormon historian, always would say Mormonism is a village. And I really like that framework because, I like going to Europe. We go to Sunstone, UK every year. And when you go stay in these little English European villages, the houses, the homes, the towns are very close together. And then they've got these big, farms outside of the town, but your village, your next door neighbor was basically in your front yard. And so the experience that I had growing up as a girl in Mormonism in Murray, Utah, the Murray 13th Ward, our neighborhood was our ward. The boundaries of our neighborhood was our ward, and everybody I knew went to church. I knew every single house in the neighborhood. I knew all their business. They knew ours. We would play night games. We would, hop in their backyards at night to play hide and seek. And it was a similar feeling of these European villages. We all knew each other, and there was something so beautiful and safe about that. And of course, there was a dark side to it too. Some of my neighbors were being sexually abused by other neighbors, and some things were going on that I had no idea about. And some people that didn't fit in felt ostracized by that. And so I think that for every light, there is a shadow side to things. And certainly our communities have that. And so when you leave Mormonism, or you sort of deconstruct your faith, or however you want to phrase it, the light side of that is you get to shed some of those oppressive, harmful behaviors that hurt you, but you also leave the village, you leave the community. And that is a sort of pain that I don't, I think that there's this human hunger in society around it in general, but to actually be ostracized from your village, and many Latter-day Saints are when they choose to leave, that's a very specific kind of urgent pain that people feel.
Yeah, Brene Brown refers to the experience as being in the wilderness in one of her books, being out there. In that, I do notice that sometimes people have had an idealized conceptualization of what their community was like, and then they would metaphorically shelf the dysfunctions, or they wouldn't even be able to be aware of them, because it was too dissonance causing, or the it affected their confirmation biases with regard to their belief systems and their sense of belonging, such that when they shifted their experience of belief, it ended up in a circumstance where all of a sudden all that stuff that they have shelved or pushed aside, they all of a sudden notice it, and then it becomes more painful, because it feels, for some people, it feels like either they felt betrayed or they felt like they betrayed themselves, that they really weren't cognizant of the dysfunctions that happened along the way.
Yeah, I think that that's so true for this experience. And I think about, I love Carl Jung, so forgive me, any of you Freudians out there who don't, but he talks about the process of differentiation, right? And it's this idea of when you have to figure out how you're different than your community. And we all experience this on some level. Every child growing up through adolescence has to experience moments of differentiation, right? You realize for a moment that, oh my gosh, wait, I'm different than my friend. I'm different than them. I actually don't like that thing, or they're teasing me for this. And sometimes that can be a big wounding to your ego or to your personality, because you realize the loneliness of being unique, the loneliness of being different. And that's a painful experience. And sometimes it's not even a wound. Maybe someone doesn't tease you or you're not left out, but you're just bored. The chronic boredness sort of makes you realize you're different. But in any case, the result, the consequence of that recognition is loneliness. And I believe Jung says, that moment, that wound casts you into the darkness, outside. And it's sort of this Joseph Campbell hero's journey. And I do think that Mormonism, our experience in Mormonism, is kind of beautiful in the sense that we get a very distinct and tangible and almost literal opportunity to have Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? For many of us, we are cast out of our village into the darkness, as Jung would say. We have to leave our village because we don't fit in, or we don't belong, or there are problems there, or, whatever reason we leave, and we go out into the wilderness or the lone and dreary world, or to slay these dragons. And in Joseph Campbell's metaphor, you go and you find the elixir, and oftentimes you bring it back to your community. It's the medicine that your community needs. But when you think about that, like even elixir and medicine, it's so bitter to swallow, right? To find these lessons in medicine, you have to differentiate. You have to experience this loneliness, and it's such a painful thing for people. And it's really destabilizing, especially when you're like me, your whole identity is built in this community. I mean, I had friends my whole life growing up. I was one of the lucky people. I fit into my ward. I had friends. I had a few neighbors that we ostracized because they were weird or different, and I have deep regrets about that now. But for me, it worked. And so it was almost, it built up a sort of fragility within myself. That when I lost that, I shattered more easily because I had never had to experience resiliency around that loneliness. I'd never had to differentiate myself from the group until, my experience was kind of dramatic. I started a podcast, and then my community sort of ostracized me all at once. I lost everything. But of course, I had a part in it, right? I didn't have to start a podcast. I didn't have to. So I don't feel victimized in that. I just feel like it was a very, like, abrasive sort of break with my community, that I was sent into the darkness, and there I was, different and alone and differentiated. And that, I think, is such a painful experience. But man, that's the journey of life. And our experience sort of grants us and gifts us that, if we're willing to take it. And I think, how beautiful. I mean, other people have a little more maybe nuanced, gentle way into the night sometimes, but for us, when the community lines are so stark, if you step outside of them, you get to really feel that break and feel it hard.
Yeah. So I want to talk about what I perceive how extroverts react to this experience. So they feel a loss of the community. They long for connection. They long for transcendent, grace-filled experiences, and they can't many times can't find that in their community because they have differentiated. And so, like, what I did is I sought out and found communities online. I was fortunate enough to meet you very early into the process. You convinced me that I was nerdy enough that I could enjoy coming to Sunstone, which I did. And I found community there. And it was very, very healing to my experience. I experienced all the kinds of vulnerability and connection and grace and love, peace, joy uh, when I was there at Sunstone with you and with other people who I met. And I felt like I belonged. And so it was kind of a salve to my soul in that experience. I was searching for that. And I would do anything at that time. Like I would have, if it was longer than just traveling from Montana to Salt Lake City, I would have done that because I was longing for that at that time. And I later found out there were these Mormon spectrum groups, and there's a website called mormonspectrum.org that has an in-person map of local support groups. And I found out that one of the people, Allison Udall, that was one of the creators of the Mormon Spectrum Group, was actually had a group in Bozeman, Montana. So I later traveled to Bozeman so I could spend time with them. And I created a group here in Billings, Montana, and soon recognized that there were other people going through the same thing I was. We created a group online, and then within about a year or so, we started meeting in person. And it was a very, I would call it a sacred experience to sit with people, to listen to their story, to hold space for their experience, to validate their pain, and to brainstorm with them of ways to navigate the things that they were navigating. Another thing that I did as an extrovert is I found out that there was an opportunity for a woman and in her 60s who had an adult disabled daughter, and they were living in a very old 1956 or 1957 mobile home that was really run down, and it had all sorts of problems. And I was their high priest group leader when the husband lived in the home. And we would go over and try to level it out, because if they opened the window, if the ground shifted too much, maybe they couldn't close the window and it would leak. And so we would tar the roof and things like that. Well, I found out that the husband was in a nursing home. He had Alzheimer's. And so I approached my wife, who remains active, nuance believing in the church today. And I suggested that we create an irrevocable trust and fundraise money to be able to buy a replacement home for this woman and her daughter. And my wife was excited about it. And I was excited about it because I felt like it was something that I could engage my former believing community, who maybe felt uncomfortable around me, but I could provide a circumstance where we could interact together and do something to make a difference, where it could feel safe for me and for them to participate together, to kind of rekindle that community experience. And so my wife and I introduced the idea to the mom, and she was very grateful for it. And we raised over $26,000 and got donations from construction companies, earth moving, electricians, and we've bought a replacement home for this woman and her disabled adult daughter. And it was a very treasured, sacred experience. I felt those experiences like I had before when I was a member of the church. But as an extrovert, I could create and do that. And because I'm a financial planner, and am familiar with trusts and planning and things like that, I knew what to do to navigate those things. Um, uh, and so there are things that extroverts do, I think, at least that's what I did and what I've witnessed other people, that we go out and we either find community or we create it in order to somehow reconnect with some of that belonging and those grace-filled, connecting, love, peace, joy experiences with service and ministering to others. And I noticed that you've been involved in some of those things too. I was wondering if you could share about some of the things that you did and you created to go out and make a difference and bring people into a community to do those kinds of things.
Sure, yeah, and I can talk about the pitfalls because, I feel like I went through a similar experience. The loss of community was so abrupt and so massive for me, but I was lucky because it was at the time when online communities were starting. Like I said, I had this feminist Mormon community that sort of took me in. Um, but I don't want to cast it in a negative light or put a negative judgment, because I think that this is an essential part of the experience. But I do think that there is a certain sort of level of trauma bonding that happens when we're cast out. And again, I cannot understate the loneliness that people feel, especially if you're experiencing doubt and disbelief for years, and you're the only one that you know. And sometimes in isolated Mormon communities, it can feel like you're the only person that feels this way. And so when you finally find that there are others like you and me that have similar experiences, it feels like you're home again, right? Um, the danger, I think, in that, especially when you haven't done the work of differentiation, is that you bond around the trauma, you bond around the blame. And so a lot of the communities, I was so eager. There was such an urgency for me to feel connected to people again. I was so bereft of what I had lost that I think I sometimes participated and contributed to unhealthy community. And that comes from when you're differentiating. There are so many muscles that Mormonism teaches you. There's a very strong utilitarianism muscle that Mormonism gives you, that like everything you do must be of value to someone else or to the community. And that can be good, but that can also wound certain personalities. Like I said, there's a shadow side to that. There's this idea of like, people have to help me. That's a muscle that we get too. I help them, they help me. It's very transactional. And I didn't unpack a lot of that thinking because it was so new. And so I recapitulated a lot of the harmful stuff in the communities. And you were talking about the dysfunction. I participated in the blogging community, and now we look back, we would say it's a lot of drama. But really, it was, all the tropes that you would give to women for being hysterical and gossipy and backbitey and cliquish and all of those things were actually playing out because we were unpacking our own misogyny and the roles that we thought women played, and we weren't differentiating what was healthy and what wasn't all the time. We were so busy blaming and pointing fingers and saying it's their fault, it's their fault. What is my work? What is my work? Should have been more of the question. And so a lot of people got hurt back in those early days online. If you go back and look, it's embarrassing to think of what it must have looked like to outsiders. I'm in several groups of the communities from people leaving the FLDS church, and you can see the chaos in those communities as they go through it. There's a lot of just cruelty and meanness and fighting and pettiness and competition, and so that pain, I think, comes from the trauma of what we've gone through, and we're trying to build community in this trauma. And so that happened in the early days online. I got involved in doing work through Year of Polygamy to help fundamentalist communities. I think that for me was about, I'd sort of already learned some lessons about the hubris, the like self-imperialism of believing like I can, help these people. It was more about interrogating for myself my judgments, the people that I had always marginalized. I had already learned that the church had sort of given me a bias against LGBT people. And when I went to my first gay club, it was like a spiritual, it was in Montana, actually, it was in Billings. I went to a gay club there and I was pregnant, a little Mormon mommy, and I wanted to go. And it was so benign and boring. There were just two couples dancing after work. It's just so lovingly. And I was just like, this is what they told me to be afraid of. Um, so I was sort of looking for God in all the places they told you not to look. And for me, going into the fundamentalist communities, it was like that. It was rejecting other communities was like rejecting a part of myself. And so we went and we did all of this really fun service projects in communities like Short Creek, where the FLDS needed people leaving the FLDS needed a lot of help, and that ended up being really important to me. But again, now I look back on that, there was a lot of just ignorance and stupidity and hubris and bad boundaries that I didn't have because I hadn't been attending to my own work. And then we've built community at Sunstone, but which we have with our conferences and our online communities, but I've really realized the limits of that as well, because like you said, if you're an extrovert, some of these communities work for you, but if you're not, then it's really challenging, and you can sit on the fringes and watch. But I've noticed a lot of people feel really restored by these communities, and a lot of people feel very ostracized from them. And we can talk about why that is, but I do think that there's a larger trend in society right now that we're all grappling with technology and the way the world is changing. The loss of community is something I think everyone is feeling. So I just want to acknowledge that anyone out there that's feeling lonely right now, you're not alone. This is a global problem. Like I said, we developed in these little cultish like tribes, and as time went on and we went more agrarian and moved into villages and then moved into cities and suburbans and the suburbs and all of that, that's changing again for us now. And we're trying to figure out, what does community look like? What in our country alone, we don't even have a shared vision or myth or idea of what democracy looks like, and we're seeing so much conflict. And so I think that this is a larger problem that we're dealing with. How do we build community within this loneliness? And I don't think that it is solved very easily. It can be remedied, like you said, with these online communities, these local ones. But really, where I'm at with it right now, if I were to give you the positive answer, is I've realized that I've had to build my own village of small, meaningful people where I derive that back and forth, that casserole giving, right? And that takes work, that takes cultivation. You have to have a relationship with people, and relationships are its own being, it's its own thing. It takes work. But it's so valuable to have that little community. And I found that community through the ex-Mormon community in a lot of ways. But it's been, a decade now of trauma bonds and chaos and infighting. And like you said, these groups will pop up and then they'll be destroyed, and they don't last long. And rather than putting a judgment on that, I just think that that's the process, because we really are trying to form communities around blame and around the trauma. And those can be so validating and so important for certain periods of our life, but I don't think that they're sustainable long term, because there's a sort of energy momentum that you need to keep up the rage. And if your whole community is based on, here's how bad the church is, or here's how bad Mormonism is, and here's what it did to us. And again, that's an important process. So I want to state, like, everyone goes through it. Do not judge yourself if you're angry at the church. Let the rage burn as long as it needs to. It burned for years and years and years for me. And in some ways it still does. But your village doesn't need to be on fire all the time. We often mistake, at least I did, drama for progress. If there was something going on, there was some sort of conflict, some tension, some some exciting news about the church that it meant something. And I think that was more about me distracting from going into the darkness and having to get good with my own self and the loneliness part. Um, because Mormonism sort of invites you to run away from the loneliness, right? We were taught the beauty of Mormonism is that you get to be with your family forever, and these sacred bonds and this dynastic ties of being in heaven with all the people you love. And I don't know about heaven at all, but I know the earth isn't like that. Life isn't like that. And I wish we would had more practice flexing the muscles of learning to be alone and to get in with our, sort of our nucleus of self. And I think our communities would be healthier if we could grapple with that better. And then we can build out and expand our compassion and expand our connections rather than just, wanting to not be alone. But like you said, when you're so lonely, that's like the first thing you're grasping at, right? You just want to not be alone anymore. Because Mormons, we don't know how to be alone.
Yeah. I remember I was working through trying to figure out, I had this underlying desire to be part of a faith community of some kind, even if it was some non-literalist or held space for agnosticism. So I found great experiences in Community of Christ. I found great experiences in our local United Church of Christ congregation, a fantastic congregation that does work with the homeless. They have an LGBTQ resource center there that's similar to Encircle. Um, they have people from the Jesus Seminar come and speak once a year. Like, it's okay to talk about Bart Ehrman, and stuff like that. And and as I was putting in work to try to figure it out, one thing that I discovered, at least for myself, is that a good part of my longing to find another community to be a part of before, a good part of it had to do with how much of my ego and sense of identity was enmeshed with what my experience was as a member of the church, as a teacher, ordinance worker with leadership callings and so forth. And what I ended up unpacking is a big part of that underlying desire was I was trying to replace that sense of enmeshment with ego. And that was really helpful for me to realize that I very may well participate in another faith community at some point, but I needed to put in work to figure out how much of that was enmeshment with ego, uh, and figuring out these other things that, like, you're talking about, like figuring out boundaries and figuring out, you referred to it as imperialism, like I have something that I need to bring to you because I'm not saying that you're less than, but I have something that you need that I don't, that I can bring to you, kind of thing. And there's internal work really that needs to be done to figure that out. And it's all part of this developmental process, it seems, that's pretty messy and not usually scripted very well. Um, but I
Yeah.
really experienced that.
I was just thinking the exact same thing for me. It is about your ego, and I'm saying that not from a place of judgment, but as much compassion as I can give myself and you. Like, of course we would have. We were taught that our identities are enmeshed and tied up in these things, and it's that differentiation. It's that longing to not be in the dark. You want to like you said, I think you said you wanted to replace it. And that, I think, is a function of grief, right? It's the denial part. We don't want to admit that part of our life is over. And I think about this Buddhist idea of, like, you must be willing to die over and over and over again. And Mormonism sort of gives you everlasting life in the sense that some of the Mormon family members that I have, their life has maintained the same momentum. It's the same. It's sort of stagnant. They haven't had to grow in any sort of direction. They've maintained their ideals. It's pretty steady. And for me, since I've deconstructed or left Mormonism, whatever you want to call it, my ideals have had to die over and over and over again. It sucks so bad. Like nothing is what I thought it would be. And then you go and you think you've got it figured out, or you think you find this new community and it's the new Zion, and then it falls apart, or somebody makes a mistake and you're like, what? How could it be? Every day is a surprise. Like that chaos can be so overwhelming sometimes. It's so beautiful and exciting though. And that's what I like about this idea of when you're differentiated, when you experience, oh no, I'm different, oh no, I'm alone, it can be a call, a call for the rest of your life of who am I? Who do I get to be? Who am I today? What is the journey ahead of me today? And when I look at these little communities, I mean, you're talking about community of Christ, and I was just thinking so fondly on my experiences too. I picture myself again in this hero's journey. We're all on a hero's journey. We leave our village. And I remember for me, it was Mormon feminism. I'm walking down the path, I'm alone. And all of a sudden, here's this crazy carnival of these amazing women doing all these things that I wanted to do my whole life. And they're letting me talk and they're letting me curate my ideas and they're giving me a voice. And it's so exciting. And I think it's the new Zion. And then there's infighting and betrayal and it's not what I thought it is. So you have to leave that community and you're walking down the path. And then there's community of Christ and they're kind and they're a soft place to camp for a while. And then you keep moving and you find this community and this community. And I think that that's okay. I think that the issue is when you think that you're building a new Zion or you're trying to replace or recapitulate the things that are gone, that have died. Like that's I think when, at least in my own life, I've gotten into trouble. When I think that I can replace or rebuild something that no longer exists. Because Mormon community, the casseroles, and for the record, Patrick Mason, I give casseroles to everybody. That I'm not saying they're good casseroles, but lots of people get my casseroles. But that sense of community and village, it comes with a shadow side. It comes with high costs and high stakes and high demands and high penalties. And anyone who's been violently ejected from that community, or not violently ejected, just ejected, knows exactly what that feels like. And if you haven't, maybe you don't know, sort of the sharp edges of that community, but that is why the community feels so safe, because it's so rigid to be thrust from. And I don't want to recapitulate that. For me to do that, I would have to start a high demand religion, to feel that sense of belonging. And I'm not interested in that. That part is gone now. And it's accepting that has been probably the biggest struggle of my life, the most stubborn struggle. I think I've stayed in the ex-Mormon community or the post-Mormon or the questioning Mormon, whatever you want to call it, community, because I didn't know how to connect with people outside of that. I mean, they were people that knew what I had gone through. And now I've, as years have gone by, I've learned, oh, I have other interests. I have other ways to connect. I connect with a lot of artists now and a lot of creators, but that has taken years for me. And part of it is because that differentiation process has just been slow. I've had to figure out, I'm still figuring out where Mormonism has sort of, altered my muscles. I'm sure you are too. And again, it's not a journey of judgment, but if you look at it as going down the road, it's just stopping at a new camp and meeting new people and having a new adventure, as long as it serves you. And then when it's time to pick up, you go and maybe you take some friends along the way. I certainly have. Some of my best friends are some of my early Mormon feminist bloggers. So, yeah, I wouldn't trade those experiences forever. I just think that the danger is when you think it's new Zion.
Yeah, I think you're referring to increasing our capacity to hold grace for ourselves and for others, right? Because we move in to these new communities or new relationships with some of the dysfunctions of the patriarchy and or uh, the judgment or whatever the dysfunctions are. We don't all of a sudden unpack and do all the work to have that not be a problem anymore once we go through a faith crisis. I mean, it's still part of us. You can have a Mormon Spectrum or a Sunstone or a Thrive group that looks like it has two leaders, and one is the Elders Quorum president and the other is the Relief Society president, and maybe you get a feel for how much patriarchy is in it based on what percentage of the people that show up are not straight white men. Maybe that gives you a feel for how you're doing in that. But it feels like you're kind of, I mean, for me, it feels like I'm kind of like stumbling through trying to figure out how to be better, how to put in personal work to figure out what I'm going to do next along the way. um, One thing that I've noticed is, with regard to groups, is it seems like there's something to be said for having smaller groups. Like I've heard John Dehlin refer to them as like a friend pod, or Bill Reel talks about having a group of maybe no more than 12 to 14, maybe 15 people in a group. Because once you get beyond that, the degree of vulnerability and emotional intimacy that you can nourish in the group starts to become diminished when the group becomes too big. And I've noticed that in some groups, as that I've gone to or participated in, as they get larger and larger and larger, it loses that some of that sense of intimacy and vulnerability, even for the extroverts. Um, what's your what thoughts do you have about the size of support groups and relationships and the frequency with which they connect with each other and things like that? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I like that framework because it forces me to sort of think about the math of it, the calculus of it. And when I do that, I think it starts with, I know this is cliche to say, but it really does start with you. Like you have to get good with the darkness because to quote the great philosopher Taylor Swift, she has a song that says, "You're on your own, kid." And it's about being, no matter what, you always think someone else is going to be the thing that saves you. But really, your whole life, it's you. You have to get good with you. And that doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of time alone, but, you know, back to Jung, he talks about these indigenous hunters who, in their tribe, some of them go off and hunt by themselves for the rest of their lives as a way to connect with the divine. And for them, the only connection they have is their dreams. And I've been thinking about that. What would a life be like completely alone? Because we're taught, man, it's not good that man should be alone. And I believe that. I believe, I'm so lucky to have such great people in my life. But I think that there's a value in getting good with being by yourself and getting connected to that, the Egyptians call, like, what is it, the Ba self, your the center of who you are. And if you can't do that, if you're running away from that and nursing other distractions with people because you can't face yourself, then you're never going to be quiet at home in any community. I really believe that. So starts with your own work. It always starts with your own work. And that involves shadow work, that involves facing your trauma. People around you are not responsible for your work. That's your part. And then I would say it's your next relationships. For me, it would be my children, or maybe it's your, intimate partner or your best friend. And relationships are just that. They're an entity in and of itself. And if you've done your work, if you're taking care and tending to your garden, so to speak, then you're healthier to be in community with people. And so it's those relationships that I think that matter next. And then you build out from there. And I like the idea of a friend pod. I don't like the word pod just because it reminds me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers as a kid, but I think it works. I think it's this idea of, COVID pods, like having your own little group of people. I certainly found that to be the case. And those are people in my life who our connection has transcended the blame and the anger and the rage. When we get together, we're not talking about Mormonism all the time. We're not talking about our trauma all the time. Of course, all those things are interacting, but we care about each other's lives. And when they're sick, I call them and I care about them and I send them things. And when I'm sick, they do the same. And that takes work. I'm want to be cognizant that there are people out there that don't feel like they can have those connections. And that one's really hard because it I feel like I was lucky that a lot of that came to me through my organizing. But it does take work. Relationships take work. And if you feel like you can't connect with people, that maybe might be a recognition that you have some inner soul work to do. Talk to a therapist. Start with connecting with a therapist first and connecting with yourself. And then you'll be surprised as you're on this journey who comes into your life. And from there, I think that it's okay to have larger communities. I still enjoy the online Mormon communities. I don't feel as free to be open in them as other people are, just because, there are a lot of reasons now. I'm trying to set better boundaries in my life. And one of them is around my own private life and personal life. There are a lot of people, because I podcast, as you might know, that sort of feel entitled to your time and your thoughts, and it just gets really overwhelming. So I've had to, unfortunately, it's very painful for me to do, but set boundaries around that. But then I have Sunstone, and that's a place where you get the larger community and you get a mix of so many diverse people that we can go engage with once a year. And it's sort of a touchstone. And it's really fun because I get to see Anthony Miller every year. And I know every year I get to give you a hug. And it's like a reunion of a larger family. But I'm not, talking to all those people all day long because I wouldn't have time. I wouldn't have the energy or capacity to do that. So I like thinking of it in that sort of mathematical way of building out and expanding. And I've been trying to do that in other aspects of my life. I think I will always stay connected to Mormon community because it's my original village. It's the village I left from, and I will keep returning to it over and over and over again. And I'm okay with that. I just think it's always on me to make sure I'm not recapitulating the things that harmed me. But I'm human and I've done it plenty of times. And you can talk to people back in the early FMH days who probably hate my guts because I said something really stupid, or who knows? I mean, I hate listening to my old stuff too, because you think you're so wise and you don't know what you don't know till life kicks your butt a little bit.
Yeah. So it's part of that increasing our capacity, I think, to hold grace for each other and for ourselves. So I want to unpack a little bit about the experience. We've been talking about experiences that are primarily of people who are extroverts, who, if we're missing that sense of community, the opportunity to serve, the opportunity to make a difference, the opportunity to experience grace and connection, like many extroverts will just go create it, or they'll go find it. But people who are naturally built as introverts, they have a very different experience. Um, uh, and I was wondering if you could share some thoughts about the experiences of introverts and what they can do and what extroverts can do uh, to provide support to provide support and make a difference, I guess, is what I want to ask.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting question. I've been thinking about the cutoff introvert and extrovert. I'm like, is that the rubric that I would use for community? But if we're going to use it, I still don't know. I'm trying to think about if that's the exact equation I would use, because I do think it's so much more complicated than like your ability to be outgoing or introverted or not. But first of all, I would say to everybody, the one of the most poisonous, toxic, harmful, hurtful, degrading day-to-day paper cuts you can get is getting online and comparing yourself to other people. And the algorithms, the capitalism, whatever you want to attribute it to, promotes that, right? If we compare ourselves, if we're always doing that calculus of what we lack, then we'll spend money, we'll buy more things, we'll join, more causes, we'll join more memberships, whatever. A lot of people are relying that we feel unworthy and unbelonging, and and deficient. And so comparing ourselves to what we think other people have is I think a dangerous lie. And it's so easy to, especially if you're quiet and introverted, to look at other people's lives and say, that's the community I want. I want to be that person. Look at all the friends that they have. Like I said, everything comes with a shadow side. And I know people, I've talked to a lot of people about this idea of like, I remember my senior year, our little friend group of girls started getting invited to all the parties, and all the people we wanted to pay attention to us were finally paying attention to us, and we felt popular and accepted. And after just a few months of it, me and my friend Malia, we were just both like, this is so much work. Like, this is work. Like, you have to work at this. You have to show up to things, and you have to be involved, and you have to be happy all the time. And we just kind of were like, we don't want it. It's too much. And whereas two of our friends loved it and they were into it and they wanted the work. And it was such an interesting experience for me to go, oh, it's not what I thought it was, belonging. It's not really my thing. Like, it's when you're outside looking in, it looks like one thing. So I think comparison is a lie. But if you're not naturally outgoing and you sit and observe, I think that there's a beautiful resiliency that introverts need to give themselves credit for. You are more comfortable with yourself when you're able to be the one who's listening all the time and not always the one talking, not always the one waiting, for their turn to talk. And I think that that's a gift that so many people in this world need. And those are the kind of friends that people want, is someone who can listen. And a lot of introverts I know are really practiced at that. So just because you're lonely or shy or, don't really have the gumption to go out and grab the friendship bull by the horns doesn't mean that you're not wanted and you're not useful. There's so much loneliness in the world. Everyone feels lonely at some point, and some people, the loneliness is so palpable, you can cut it with a knife. And so your personality, your friendship, your gifts, your life experiences, there's someone out there for everyone to connect with. I really truly believe that, and I've seen that over seeing thousands of people go through this experience. And I would say all relationships take work, unfortunately. They all involve going out of a comfort zone. My mom was an extrovert, and my paternal grandmother, was an introvert. And I remember the story when you were talking about introverts. I think about this. My mom would complain. She would say, your grandma Hansen would always complain that nobody ever invited her to things. And I would say, well, why aren't you being the one inviting them over to your house? And I thought, that's not fair. That's not who my grandma is. That's just not part of her makeup. And I've often thought about that false dichotomy that we put into people when we're saying, like, if you want friends, you got to go out and find them. That's not really fair. And so when I say relationships take work, I don't mean to say it's your fault that you're lonely. I think that there are a lot of things, and in our world right now, especially, where loneliness is going to become an increasing chronic problem until we can figure out more healthy ways to have community. And I don't just mean online chat groups. But I would say, I don't know, my advice to introverts right now is maybe practice using your voice in spaces that feel comfortable. Maybe practice when you notice that somebody needs help on an online group and you can provide a listening ear, be that listening ear. Do it with boundaries. Ex-Mormons are terrible at boundaries. Don't ruin your marriage over it. Don't ruin someone else's marriage over it. Don't be inappropriate or demand things that aren't yours. But there's a lot you can give, and I would be looking for opportunities to see how you can share your gifts, because I do think that they're needed. You don't have to go out and start a group, and you don't even have to join a group. I think that there are so many ways now to interact online that if that's the place to start, then let it be the place to start. My son is deeply, deeply introverted. He's on the spectrum, and he seemed to find this small community of people online that like the same video games that he does and like the same chat groups. And so I really do believe that people find what they are working towards and what they're interested in. And so one of the best ways introverts can find community is to sort of nurture the things they're passionate about themselves. Um, water the garden that you want to grow in yourself. If you really like a certain hobby, get into the hobby more, nurture the things about yourself that you like. And I think that in doing so, you're going to find more people. I don't even know if that's sufficient, but those are some of my ideas.
Yeah, some of the most, I don't know what other word to say other than sacred type of conversations that we've had in our local Mormon Spectrum group have been when the majority of the attendees at a meetup are the introverts, and they are in a place where they feel safe sharing their experience and their nuance. Uh, and it's a gift to me to because I'm able to learn about, see, and witness things that are different than I would naturally experience or function by having those participants of the group share their experiences.
Well, and I
Um,
think there's some introverts that even hear that and we're like, no, I can't even go to a thing. I don't want to go to a thing. I don't want to share my voice. But I think that that's the discomfort that we have to work through. And maybe the answer is not sharing your voice or going to a conference or whatever. But when I talk about those Mormon muscles that you flexed your whole life, look at the boxes you put yourself in your life. For me, it was, you know, Lindsay is the artist. She is the one who is the cook for her family. I had all these roles and stereotypes of who Lindsay was as a Mormon woman. And I've really realized like some of those things don't apply to me at all anymore. And people used to tell me that I was extroverted. And over the years, I've become deeply introverted. People don't see that because I'm on podcasts and I'm talking, but if you ask my closest friends, I spend the majority of my time alone. I love being in my garden with my headphones, tending to my roses. I would do that all day long, every day if I could. It's just been such a beautiful thing to me. So I don't want people to feel like the only answer is you have to get out there and find a group. But I do think that there is an opportunity for all of us to make sure that we're making space for introverts to have those experiences and those conversations. I spent a lot of years being the one with the mic, being on a podcast. I still do it, but I've spent the last few years, especially, I don't feel like I've had a lot of wisdom to impart. I feel like this has been several years of me just listening and trying to understand things more. And I think that's also something that we can do when we're interested in building community is, are we listening? The people who are extroverted and who like to talk, are we listening? Are we listening to people too? Are we giving chances for other people to share their wisdom? Because there's so much collective wisdom in our communities. And sorry, my dogs are growling. And we should we should not give them time to talk, but we should give introverts more. Again, I don't like the word introvert because I think that that's too cut and dried, but different experiences and different types of people more time to talk. Give them the microphone more, if
yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, certainly it's a spectrum of experience. Um, okay, so to kind of revisit, we've talked about people experience connection, they experience service, ministering, things that we used to call the fruits of the spirit. When they're in community, they differentiate, and then they go out and they seek to replace that because they're lonely, because of enmeshment with identity and ego. But it's a developmental process, and we're going to be messy, and we're going to make mistakes, and we need to do internal work. And it's kind of an ongoing thing. So it's like we're not necessarily going to find a group where we're going to go just walk into it the next day and it's going to go, oh, This is everything that we need, just like the church pre-programmed everything for us. This is going to give us everything we need. That's not going to happen. So it's a journey. It's more of the hero's journey kind of metaphor. I think that's what some of what we're talking about here, for people that are going through the experience. And that probably feels pretty defeating for someone who's in the very beginning of it, because they're like, this is so lonely and so painful. And you're suggesting that there's not like just a place that I can go that will take it all away, because there's not, right?
I know that's the bad news and the good news. I mean, it's such bad news and it's such good news that nothing is what you think it is. And I again, I look at the people who are safe in the village. I'm saying this with as least judgment as possible. Um, they won't get the experience of knowing what the world is like out there on that path. When you're stagnant and safe, you don't have those growth moments, and so you kind of stay in your little potted plant, and that's what it is. And if that's how you live your life, then that's a perfectly fine choice. A lot of people do that, but there are many of us thrust into the darkness, finding the call into the loneliness. And once you're there, you're there. You're into it. And it's such good, beautiful news that nothing is what you think it is, because you get to, like the Buddhists say, die over and over and over again and live 100 lives in one lifetime. And there's something really, really beautiful about that. And that utilitarianism that you have in Mormonism can be useful outside, but you also realize that your worth isn't just about what you can do. It's about experiencing things. And I would say, if you feel overwhelmed by that idea that there is no Zion, when I think about my little hero's journey into one of the little villages, Community of Christ, they gave me one of the most helpful tools. And I would say, if you're in that beginning stage, Community of Christ is such a great touch point. They are such a welcoming little village of their own that will welcome us in with warm blankets and hot soup, on those cold nights. And I remember I had been really struggling with this loneliness and this disorientation of, like, if the church isn't true, if what I was taught wasn't true, then what is true? Like, my grandma just died. Like, what do I do with that? And I was asking Robin Linkart, who was a Community of Christ apostle, do you believe you're going to see her again? Like, what does heaven look like? And she gave me the most Community of Christ answer possible, where she was like, well, we spent many years in our church trying to understand what heaven looks like, so we knew what to do to get there. And now we've realized that we don't know. We don't know what heaven looks like. And we actually don't know what it takes to get there. So we're going to build moments of Zion now. And I love that idea of building moments of Zion now. And I think that you've expressed that, and I've expressed that too, which is, you'll go out on your journey and you will always be alone. And that's why it's important to have, your center self. You get good with that. And that's a lifetime process. But you get to go to these villages and experience these moments and these connections. And when I get to hug Anthony Miller at a conference, when I get to talk to someone for the first time, and I feel that like electric connection that is a memory of the community that I have, it's such a beautiful moment of Zion. And that's what we get. That's all we get. That's actually all anyone ever gets. We build up these idealized versions around it, like you said, of what we think community is, but that's really what it's about. But I will say, for me now, those moments are so much more stark and like precious to me, and sacred, if you will, if you want to use that language, because you recognize the contrast. You know what it's like to not have them. It's being in the desert and tasting water, and water always tastes the best when you're thirsty. And I think that that's what can happen in these communities. And some of us need more nourishment, so you might need to seek out more of those moments. And it will be a messy process, and it won't be perfect, and people will let you down, and they will hurt your feelings and be rude and leave you out, and all of the things that come with the shadow sides of community. But you'll also connect with people. You'll meet new friends. You'll step out of your comfort zone. You'll learn something you didn't know about yourself and about other people. And that's what's worth it. That's the journey. And maybe you never stay in one village again and you're just off, visiting as a tourist forever. But I think as long as you have yourself to return to, you'll always be at home. And I think that that's the beautiful gift of life, that we get to have these beautiful moments of connection with others and with self. And to me, what is more important than that?
I agree. I love that. So I know we're running late, but I wanted to ask one more question. And this might be too big of a topic, but there's a complexity that people experience with the things that we're talking about when they're in mixed faith relationships, when they're in a mixed faith marriage, or they are really close in proximity to parents or children who are still very orthodox or fundamentalist, literalist type believing, where an individual is trying to go through and navigate the kinds of things that we're talking about, um, while they're simultaneously navigating these mixed faith relationships. What thoughts or observations do you have about that?
That one is so interesting because it's all of these things that we're talking about, but in partnership, right? And especially when, it's a partnership with an intimate partner, your spouse or partner or whatever like that. You have this dichotomy of such pain and disconnect of not being on the same page and not going on the journey together. You're not going down the path. But again, that's an illusion. The reality is we all are on our own path, all of us. And our relationship with our intimate partners is it's I always think of it's its own person. There's your spouse and you, and your relationship is its own thing. And so when you go through a mixed orientation marriage, I really do believe that that thing, that new person, is on its own journey too. And there's a lot of growth that happens. And I would say the same thing, even, I've been sort of, I guess you could say, I don't mean to be condescending, but a negative light of people that stay in the village and never grow. But I've noticed, even in my own family, my leaving the village and going off on my path has forced those within my family to grow in different directions that they would have never had without that experience of me sort of stepping out of line. And I think that that happens in these situations. And it's a growth experience. And the relationship it goes on its own journey of relationship. And how that ends and what town or village it ends up in depends on the people in it and the work that they're willing to do. But I think as long as people are willing to stay invested and connected to the thing, to the person, then no matter where you're going to be okay. Because I mean, I don't even know why I'm saying this. You've done this way longer and more successfully than I have. So I think you have probably a lot more to share. So maybe you can say if I'm right or wrong about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. You talk about this idea of multiple deaths and rebirths, and you've talked about the relationship as being almost as if it's a separate person or identity. And one thing that I've witnessed is whether or not there's a mixed faith marriage, when there is a faith transition, uh, and a deconstruction of meaning of everything, individuals experience a renegotiation of their intimate relationship, of their marital or partnership relationships as well, because it was based on foundationally some things that are missing blocks now. And so I think everybody to a certain extent, or the majority of people to a certain extent, go through a renegotiation and a death of that entity, and hopefully some sort of rebirth to the extent that it's helpful for that relationship. Sometimes it's just not, and it doesn't end up continuing. For my wife and I, what was helpful was she's the nuanced introvert that already held space for my more literalist, linear, concrete thinking version of Mormonism. We were in a mixed faith marriage, and I didn't even realize it when I was a believer. And then when I shifted because that's kind of how she was built. Um, she had capacities that I didn't even know she had to be able to hold space for me in my experience that I was having as I was deconstructing, as I was going through my faith crisis. One thing that we put in a lot of work to do, and which we continue to do, is to identify and nourish what our shared spiritual language is for us. So whether it's service to others, or whether it's time in nature, or whether it's reading and contemplating things, things that we share together while holding space that we each have things that we don't share, that are, there are things that feed me and that I feel like I thrive in that are not helpful for my wife at all. And same thing for her. There are things that in which she thrives and that helps her that it would be unhelpful for me to be a part of. Uh, but we found shared things, and so for us, the On Being podcast, Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth, Jack Kornfield's Buddhism for Beginners, um, uh, books about history. Brian McLaren has a fantastic podcast called Learning How to See, and we listened to that together. We both loved it. And we've been listening to Brian McLaren's book, Faith After Doubt, together too. So there's some things that we're able to share, and that where we still experience the same kinds of sense of spiritual connection that we had before in shared spiritual language in the things that we do. But we've differentiated, so we each have our own. And so I like what you said about that it's like a separate person that goes through a death and rebirth. Um, and
And that
that's been my
person has to
experience.
differentiate, right? Like even that relationship has to differentiate from where it begins and ends with the church,
Yeah.
and where you begin and end. And there's an enmeshment in Mormon relationships in general, and this especially with our spouses, but like with all of us, where we don't know where we start and the other person ends. And that can feel really good, but it's also really codependent. And the shadow side is really negative. And so that differentiation, again, it's so painful, it's so lonely, it's so scary, is beautiful because it leads us to the truth of life, which is that we are all alone. I mean, in the way that I think of my roses in the garden, every plant that comes out of the earth is its own plant, and it will die alone and it will grow alone, but it gets to be there with the grass and the birds and the other plants and trees. And that's us. We're that. We get to have these moments of connection and Zion and enlightenment and beauty. But we're still us by ourselves. And that doesn't have to be scary. For a long, long time, it was scary, especially when you're thrust into the darkness and you think that you'll be there always, or that you deserve to be there, or that you're unworthy because you're alone. And that's, the inner work that I'm still, doing, that you're still doing, that we're all going to be doing. But having a spouse to be alone with is kind of a beautiful journey, to walk alone with someone. And I think it's really beautiful to watch what you and your wife have done, because you're listening to the same podcast together. I love the idea of a shared spiritual language. I think that partnership for me is about that. It's just about finding someone to slay dragons with, on the journey, or to ask questions with, or to figure out what village to stop in, and sometimes saying goodbye and parting ways while you each go on your own journeys and adventures and reconnect. And if you can find someone that has the patience to invest and to do that and to go on that adventure with you, then I think that that's really special too.
I think it's scary along the way, can be terrifying, because sometimes what the marriage maybe gets the marriage that existed and the relationship actually gets uncovered and exposed through a faith transition, right? And it's less easy to ignore dysfunctions that were there already in the first place. that were, band-aided over with a common belief. Um, and sometimes those relationships don't continue. And sometimes that's the better thing. But it's absolutely scary, terrifying, potentially, to be faced with that realization that it all just needs to be, it's all going to go through a death and a rebirth and a renegotiation. And it might mean that it is richer and more grace extending and grace filled, or it might not continue.
Yeah, I always think fear is just like the anticipation of pain, right? And my whole life, it just feels like I am on some precipice, looking over, oh no, falling off a cliff, getting up, walking again, and here's another precipice over and over and over again. And in that, every time I fall and every single time I get up, I'm astounded. Like you said, your wife, you found stuff inside of her, this resiliency, these gifts that you didn't even know that she had. And that's what happens when you fall into the darkness. You have to be willing to go towards the things that scare you. And that's the only way that we really can grow. I mean, you look at the way that trees grow through cracks, how they bend and adjust to the wind and to where the light is. And that's all I think humans are doing along the way. And so, yeah, I think everyone needs to embrace the loneliness. If you're out there and you're feeling lonely and disconnected, you're not alone. You're lonely in community because the whole world is struggling with that problem. But if you want connection, get out your backpack and your map and head into the darkness, I think.
Yeah, Brian McLaren in his book Faith After Doubt attributes meaning to faith as being willing to step through that doorway into the dark, not knowing what's on the other side. That's what faith is. I'm like, well, that's an interesting attribution of meaning for faith. But I think it accurately provides a representation of what this living in the wilderness and stepping into the darkness and realizing that this is going to be a process of self-discovery and and learning and growth, that it's going to be worth it. So, well, Lindsay, thank you so much for spending some time with me this evening. I really appreciate you coming on my podcast and helping me out. And I'm just really grateful for you and all the things that you do and the impact that you've had on my life.
Well, thank you. I'm will do anything for you. I mean this. I've been on this journey now a long time. I met a lot of people, and we're all broken and traumatized and messed up and make mistakes. But I have to say, Anthony, you've always been just a remarkably boundaried, safe, kind human to everyone that I know. I think that's a rare thing. You are doing your work. I mean, I'm sure it's happened, but I would be shocked that your trauma has spilled out onto other people. You seem very good at doing your work. So thank you for being one of the good men in our community, the brave men to be vulnerable and to do your work. I always say this, but our community needs more brave men. So thanks for being one of them.
Thank you so much.